How did they convince women that like men were the problem? Men had everything that women wanted, and like women needed to go ahead and take what men had after they kind of, came back from fighting the biggest war of the 20th century and dying in this war. This idea of like they convinced women that men had all the agency and that women had zero agency for their lives, right? That they were just completely at the mercy of men, right? And they had no choices, they had nothing. That was the narrative that was spun. It's really interesting when you think about it, right? Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Ancient Intelligence. You've got your host Anya Shack here, and today I want to get into it. I want to talk about trust. I want to talk about trust between men and women and the big trust gap that exists. There's huge amounts of distrust between the sexes, and you can feel it permeating in so many aspects of our society. And I just really wanted to get into that today, and I've been thinking about it for a little while, and I'm going to riff on this, and I have some examples and anecdotes as always, but I generally want to kind of go through it in this way and do a little intro about kind of what I feel and see is happening and where it could have possibly come from, and then kind of break it down into three main areas of focus where that like distrust is actually coming from. One of them is the disrespect for the sacrifices that men make. And specifically, there was a great incident, not a great incident, a terrible incident that happened this week that I'll get into in the media. And it's just like a really great view. And it just shows us exactly what I mean by the disrespect we have for the sacrifices that men have made and still continue to make for our society. Number two, sexuality overload. It's just absolutely insane. There's a really great quote from Louise Perry's book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And she talks about how, we are repaganizing. And she's so right. And I'm going to get into what that means and what she talks about and how I see this idea of sexuality overload with some great examples. And then finally, just the erosion of men's spaces. That's a huge root cause for a couple of other things that have happened because of this erosion of men's spaces that has continued to push the trust gap and continue to make trust a bigger problem for men and women in general. So let's just get into it. I hate this. I hate the distrust that exists. I hate the fact that so many men feel like they can't trust women. So many women feel like they can't trust men. And there's just this real misunderstanding and difficulty that exists because there's so many layered nuances. But I will say that I have a femininity teacher. Her name is Jillian Pothier, and I've actually had her on the podcast before I changed it from Venus and Mars to Ancient Intelligence. And she has a great teaching that is, even though men lead in action, the frequency of the feminine goes first, right? Her frequency and how she carries herself and what she's really emanating from the inside out is what drives a man to act or not act, and what really drives a man in so many different ways. And so on a micro scale, you can kind of see it when, a woman will say like, okay, well, I'm still single. I'm not getting asked out. Like, I'm not getting noticed. I'm not getting what I want. And it's like, well, even though she might think she might be available, her energy is deterring the men in question in a couple of different ways, right? She's effectively blocking it. She's effectively saying through her energy, stay away. And so that's a really big part of women's work. And so because of that feminine frequency going first, I really believe that there is a big responsibility that women have to wake up to a lot of things that they're asleep about. And so it's one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about this, and I want to talk about these things in a bigger way. So trust, let's get into it. I've read this a couple of different times, and I've tried to think about it for myself, this notion that how the heck did they convince women that their worth is all about success and money and how educated they are, right? How did they convince women of that after men had just come back from fighting like the darkest evil imaginable, right? How did they convince women that like men were the problem? Men had everything that women wanted, and like women needed to go ahead and take what men had after they kind of, came back from fighting the biggest war of the 20th century and dying in this war. And it just, I'm thinking to myself, this idea of like they convinced women that men had all the agency and that women had zero agency for their lives, right? That they were just out completely be at the mercy of men, right? And they had no choices, they had nothing. That was the narrative that was spun. It's really interesting when you think about it, right? And also everything that kind of culminated in what was going on in the 1950s in the United States specifically. Women were very isolated, living in suburbs. They didn't have community like they had for hundreds and thousands of years beforehand. They were out of a job in many ways, even though they were obviously taking care of the home and their kids. There was a big separation that was going on, right? There was clearly an emotional separation in their relationships. Men were gone all day. There was just separation in general. And I want to kind of dive into this teaching that this Rabbi Friedman, he has this great teaching that he talks about, and this idea that man's greatest fear is to wake up one day and realize he's nothing. Like men's greatest fear is really to be nothing, to do nothing, to amount to nothing. Whereas woman's greatest fear is being swallowed up by man. He talks about this in depth with the really beautiful storytelling around man was created from dust, so he's like intimately connected to what it means to be nothing. And so he's trying all his life to just be something, to master something, to contribute, to be valued for his contribution and who he is and what he makes happen and how he takes care of things and how he provides. This is so innate. And for a woman, her greatest fear is being swallowed up by man. She comes from man's rib, so she is intimately aware of this fear of not being herself, not being alive, not being different from man, not being unique from man, right? Think about a toxic relationship or a relationship that's not going well and that like you can easily see is not working. I just watched The Best Man. It's a Taye Diggs movie from like the 90s, and there's this group of guys where one of the guys was constantly being emasculated by his partner, and he's just like down and out, and the vibe is nobody respects him, right? Everyone can see what's happening, and it's like he's effectively living what he fears most, this feeling of being nothing. She makes him feel like he's nothing, and it's miserable and heartbreaking. You see it so often. On the flip side, for a woman, when she's in a bad relationship, and everyone can tell, imagine it's like a group of girls, the moment that her man comes around, all of her glow is gone. All of her light is gone. Like nothing that she thinks or wants or cares about or believes in it's all gone when he's around. She is living her greatest fear, which is being swallowed up by man. She's gone. She's at his mercy in so many ways, right? He's not making her feel beautiful and vibrant and like she matters, right? We all have seen those types of dynamics. I'm sure ourselves and our friends have been involved in those types of dynamics, right? As we're growing. And so if you think about that, women having been convinced that they didn't have agency, and I'm thinking about that right now. This episode might just be a lot of questions, but I am going to get to those three spaces, those that I think are really, really important. But I think it's important here to kind of get at this agency dynamic and what was going on with women during that time. I imagine a lot of the women felt like they were swallowed up, right? They were missing what they had before when women and men were co-creating and in partnership, pre-industrial era, right? Women were doing the women's work, men were doing the men's work, and everyone kind of had a role to play. And yes, though women absolutely had a role to play in the 1950s housewife breadwinner dynamic, there was obviously something missing there for her own sense of agency and purpose. It's interesting. It's a really good conversation to have. I think there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And I think that's important, that Thomas Sowell quote. And because of that, I think I asked myself lots of questions, right? So if that woman at that time, because we've been moving from survival, pre-industrial, like people are just surviving. We're making our own fabrics. We're taking care of animals. Like everyone is just surviving, man, woman, children. Now we've moved towards this like leisure, this time of leisure that we kind of live in now. And I feel like the 50s were kind of this middle, this transitioning period here, the way that we have things going in the United States specifically. So survival wasn't necessary anymore. People were in suburbs. The man's salary was enough to cover. And so this notion of like, did a woman have the agency at that time to research and write a book, to do something she's actually passionate about? Maybe she did and maybe she didn't, right? Maybe at that time, because there was no access access to what we have access to now, right? We're in the information age. Like we have access to anything from the comfort of our own home. Back then, maybe she didn't have access. And so I think that it's a tough question, right? It's what I'm in the midst of. And so I just want to come here and kind of share that. Does that choice have to be made? Does that choice have to be made? I'm not sure, right? I admire people like Mary Harrington and Louise Perry, and these are women who are researching and writing about things they care about. It's not like they're doing a job that someone is forcing them to do for the survival of their family, right? No, they're doing something they're passionate about, and they are starting a family. They're becoming mothers, and they're doing those things together. Is that something that I would like to do? I'd like to think that I can get married, become a mother, and also write a book, right? I'd love to think that. But if I couldn't, I think it's an important question. Like if I had to make a choice, I think now in my kind of like 34 years of age, I would choose motherhood. I would choose that over writing a book. And I think that's just because of where I've come to in my life and what I've realized matters and the existential aspect and crises of life that so many of us are in, right? I have a lawyer friend who would make the exact same choice. She would leave the firm right now. I know other women that wouldn't make that same choice. Do we have to make that choice? I don't know. That's a really good question. Maybe we don't anymore because of the place that we're at in our world where we're not surviving anymore. There are a lot of opportunities. So I think that's just an interesting modern predicament we kind of have ourselves in, to the point of sacrifices. As women, we want to do things we love and that we're passionate about. But one thing I know about men is they have learned, and for most of all of history, they have not lived that way. They have done things that they have to do to make sure that everyone is okay. And that is something that for thousands and thousands of years, we have respected and honored men for, right? The sacrifices that they make. And so I think one of the reasons that there's a huge erosion of trust right now is this idea that there's such a disrespect towards men and the way that they have sacrificed straight up. And so talking about this news story, it came out, George from the Tin Men was reporting on it, and he talked about the news story about the English supermarket, this like supermarket giant. Basically, some women on the sales floor essentially are suing the company because they get paid a couple of dollars less than the warehouse workers. They're complaining because they want the same job, right? But the reality is it's not the same job. It's effectively female shop workers that work daytime hours. They are inside, they're sat the whole time, very low risk job, very sociable job, same workplace every time. They want the same pay as warehouse workers who have crazy unsociable hours, back-breaking physical labor work, regularly outside in frigid temperatures, super high risk, not local workplace. There's so much more difficulty in this warehouse job. And just for women, because it's mostly female that work in the shop, for women to demand this, it's just like a huge slap in the face to men and what men have done to keep society functioning and striving. And I just think it's obscene, right? And it's stuff like this that just really erodes the trust. I understand men that are just like throwing their hands up. I have super high compassion for that because it's just like, it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't happen that way. It's just so unfortunate because there's such an either or conversation. It's like people think that, well, if it's not this conversation, then it's the housewife breadwinner conversation. It's like, no, for thousands and thousands of years, again, women have done women's work and men have done men's work, and women have respected and honored men for doing that. And they've always felt their agency as women and as different from men, and being able to function in society as very different from men and being loved and honored for that. Right. And it's always been that way. And the fact that it's not that way is just, like, in my opinion, a symptom of our modern era of comfort and peace and no wartime, no war. Right. It's just things change real quick when we're talking about war. Suddenly women don't want to be like men. Right. It's so unfortunate. And it's like a big, massive reality check that's required right now. So that's one thing. Number two, I think the sexuality thing, just so much overloading access everywhere. It's just crazy. I think that this kind of dovetails into my third point about men's spaces. I think that women are just, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, because they've just kind of been swimming in it, like they're bringing sexuality into spaces where it previously didn't exist and where people don't want it to exist, you know? Great example is like creators that make sexual content kind of under the guise of like other content, right? So like take a pottery maker girl, right? She's making pottery pottery, but she's always wearing just like tiny little bikini tops or tiny little like robes, and things are always slipping and you can always see some of her body as she's making pottery. And then there's like this lack of accountability for it, right? Because then it's like you have men that are commenting and talking about her body and saying things, right? And then it's like, oh, I can't believe you're talking about my body. We make pottery here. Don't you know that? And it's like, if you look at the breakdown of who her followers are, it's maybe 10% of people that are following this woman are interested in pottery at all. There's just no accountability whatsoever. It's very manipulative and it's very coercive, like dark feminine energy. And it's so distrustful, right? It's just so weird. And I also think there's this weird, again, because women have never had to, they've never cared much, they've never been told that it's important, they've never really studied sex differences, and they don't understand like the difference between the way the male brain and the female brain works, right? Thinking about like how much more visual men are than women, thinking about the way that men and women engage with the world. I always come back to like a little boy and a little girl, and there's a puddle and they're playing, and this little girl will like look at the puddle, see that there's a puddle, and like gracefully hop over it. Meanwhile, this boy will like, he'll be wet and in the puddle before he even knew that there was a puddle. That's just the action first, think later, like impetus of the male brain sometimes. And it's just so interesting. I'm saying that because there's the counter argument of like, well, don't look if you don't want to look. And it's like, I didn't ask for this to be here. I'm just on a social media site that's not supposed to be sexual, right? That's why I share that story, because it just appears and now men are already in it, right? It's just really manipulative. That's kind of like the gateway to the actual porn industry and actual sexual marketplace and like OnlyFans and all of that stuff. And it makes me think of the thing that happened with Lily Peters, I think is her name, or Lily Phillips. I don't know. Very heartbreaking. And just like the woman who was celebrating and praising herself for having sex with 100 men in one day. That's what makes me think of Louise Perry when in her book she talks about how, we're repaganizing. It's thanks to Christianity that women were given their agency that they might not have had before. It's thanks to Christianity that rape became wrong and punishable, right, by law. It's thanks to Christianity that it's about yin and yang coming together to create a partnership such that you can bring children into this world and create something beautiful out of this life, right? There was some comment on the Lily Phillips stuff about you just went right back to something that generations of women did have to endure during pagan times, right? Especially lower class women. And here you are effectively doing this for what? For money, for profits. It's just really heartbreaking. And it creates so much distrust between men and women because it just like completely buries what women and femininity and what being a woman is really all about. And then I think like when it comes to now all of that, sexuality being in spaces where it shouldn't really be, that kind of goes into the third point that I want to make about the erosion of men's spaces, right? I think that's a really big one. I remember I wrote about this in my Substack. There's this video I saw about when women entered Australian bars for the first time in the 1970s. And the headline was men's reactions ranged from discomfort to outright misogyny. And I actually watched the video and I was like, gosh, these men are so misunderstood, just like words put in their mouth. Because what these men were frustrated about is like out of care and respect, true care for women in general, men didn't want women in their spaces because that's where men kind of act wild in there. They curse, they say whatever they want, they make fun of each other in really crass ways. Like, I don't know what they do. And you know what? I think there's something sacred to men's only spaces and also female only spaces. The erosion has happened for men and their spaces. And it's like, because they care for women so much, it's like they're always on their, or they used to be, always on their best, behavior in front of women. That's how it always was. Because in these all male spaces, they do whatever it is that they do that makes them kind of sharpen each other up and, make fun of each other, and whatever it is that they do to make each other better, that's what they do in these spaces. And they let loose and they don't have to worry about being offensive. And it's just, imagine not having a place where you can just let loose. loose and like be yourself. And it's just so unfortunate that women cannot respect men enough to let them have that. It just doesn't make sense, right? This idea that like the more you bring men and women together and erode their spaces, it's like the better things will be. And it's clearly the exact opposite is true. The worse things are. And coming around a really beautiful woman used to be something really exciting for a man. And he would like fix his collar and fix his lapel, and it would be something like that. And for a woman too, like coming around a man would be something really exciting and interesting. And there was this mysterious mystique, and we have eroded that. I think there are a couple of things that have come from that is like this idea that, well, now women are saying they want to be like men. And so they're talking like men, they're, joking like men. And so then I think a lot of times, like a friend of mine was actually telling me that he was kind of having some banter with a girl that he was talking to. It was banter, banter, banter back and forth. And then I think he said something that I guess she was offended by. And that's it. She never spoke to him again. And he was like, you engaged a dog to play with you. And then the dog was playing. You guys were having fun. It was great. And then the dog bit a little bit too hard. And now you're mad at the dog. It's the dog's fault. And it's like, no, again, feminine frequency goes first, as I said in the beginning of this. So, and he was like, well, I'm done with that. Like, I don't even know what to do anymore. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to not say. I just feel like I'm losing myself and losing my mind. It's too complicated. There's so many mixed rules. There's like a lack of reality that's going on, and that's causing so much erosion of trust. It's just all frustrating. Same with being asked out, right? Same with like post Me Too stuff. I think there's this, it's confusing because there's no clarity, and it's just creating distrust. This idea that, well, another friend was telling me like, well, if a man asks a woman out and she says no, then it's like, okay, well, he's done. He's never going to approach her again. And meanwhile, somewhere in her mind and somewhere in her psyche, thousands of years of like the dance between the masculine and the feminine, she has had this idea of like, I want to play a little hard to get, and thinking about the Baby It's Cold Outside song and the coy, flirtatious dance that men and women did for so long, and the trust that needs to be there to engage in something like that, and the joy and the fun that is such a huge part of the aliveness that we feel as men and women. And when there's no trust, you can't have that, right? You cannot have that because now the stakes are so high. The stakes are so incredibly high, and it just doesn't make sense. I had a girlfriend that was just telling me recently, that she had a couple of men flirt with her over the last week, and it made her feel so alive and happy. And it's like, yeah, that's how it's supposed to be. And the same is true for men, right? The opposite way. Like we're supposed to, everything's so sanitized, everything's so sanitized because of this distrust. Whereas it's not supposed to be that way. There's supposed to be so much more risk and so much more adventure in approaching the opposite sex and having interactions. And it's just really unfortunate and sad. And I think there is this real mystery and mystique that is made possible through really intact, really solid sex-specific spaces, like men's only spaces and women's only spaces, really honoring and celebrating that. Modesty out in public, like that is really good for relationships. Respecting each other for our differences is really good. And so, yeah, those are a couple of things that I'm thinking about when it comes to distrust. I would love to hear how any of this lands, any thoughts, any questions. I would love to hear in the comments. Until the next one. If you found value in what I'm doing here, please help me grow the podcast. And you can do one of two things. Either share the episode with a friend or leave me a review on Spotify or Apple. This will help me so much. Until next time.